Buenos días y todos. Es un honor hablar este evento. Doy gracias a la universidad por la invitación. Mi presentación es en inglés. We have to rethink so many familiar things. We have to recognize we live amongst a very difficult situation. So much is unknown. So many problems are available to be solved, but we deceive ourselves that we can solve more than we realize. Many problems we simply have to learn to live with. We have to adapt to. And we also have to confront the fact that there are problems that we just cannot solve. So we live in a very difficult world. And almost every time that I speak, I kind of refer to the quotation by Albert Einstein. You can't solve a problem with the thinking that created it. So we have to learn to think in another way. And we have to face the fact that unless we create a condition of sustainment, we're not going to survive. Sustainment is the imperative, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about it later. Now, this is not simply a matter of choice, because in fact, without sustainment, we have nothing. Now, the idea of sustainment is not the same as sustainability. Sustainment is a project. It is a project, an intellectual and a practical project, equivalent to, or if not greater than, the Western Enlightenment. It is fundamentally a process of change, changing the world that we've created, the world of human occupation, so that we actually create a future with a future. This is in the context of us all being at the beginning of the 6th planetary extinction event. This process has already started. 257 million years ago, at the most dramatic of all these extinction events, 90% of all living life was extinguished. Everything that we have that lives is a result of that 10%. So the challenge that everybody on this planet faces is creating a situation that counters this process of extinction. This is the huge design challenge. As I've just said, the challenge is about getting to the future. So we've created a situation, an unsustainable situation that we've made. And that situation is fundamentally because we've created the Anthropocene, the world within the world of human occupation, the ethos of the period of humanity. So the world that we've created is now in opposition to the world upon which we depend. So to break free from this situation, design has to be a project of transformations. We have to break out of our disciplinary condition of containment. We can't engage the problem by the limited partition of knowledge that we currently exist in. So, from the design perspective, designers have got to be better informed. They've got to have a much greater understanding of the world. They need to be more substantially theorized, but they also have to have far greater practical capability. All this means that designers can no longer simply be service providers. working under the direction of clients and with briefs upon which they are unable to reflect and transform. So against this background, I'm going to show you 6 perspectives. The future, complexity, thinking about the human, the university, design education, and some of my thoughts on Colombia. So to start with, the future. We, our species, Homo sapiens, can't be certain for the reasons I've explained in relation to extinction that we have an assured future. Our sense of our permanence is misplaced. We suffer from a condition that Nietzsche called chronophobia, the fear of time. We are frightened of time. We cannot think in time. We have an illusion of permanence. We think everything will last. So from this perspective, we have to make a number of moves. We have to understand that there will only be a future if we remake design. Design is absolutely crucial, but not as it is. Equally, we have to change. The problem fundamentally is us. It's how we make a world. It's how we live. It's our values. It's our conduct. So, one of the fundamental imperatives of design is changing us. So, the unsustainable world is a broken world, and we are part of what is broken. Designing has to understand this concept, which I call the dialectic of sustainment. And what the dialectic is a kind of recognition is that every time we create, we also destroy. This is unavoidable. But what we have is a history where we've failed to recognize this process of destruction. We don't take responsibility for what we destroy. We don't make an ethical decision when we're creating between what we bring into existence and what we take out of existence. So this requires a different kind of critical reflection. We have to identify what it is that we destroy. We don't do this knowingly. We do it mostly unwittingly. And designing is deeply implicated in this process in the creation of the Anthropocene. So we're not on the outside of this process. We're on the inside of it. And as I've been saying, in the end, what we destroy is us. So that's the first snapshot. The second one is about thinking complexity. So much that we have taken to be certain is now uncertain. Complexity, in a sense, has become beyond our ability to understand the complex. Pardon me. We exist in a metaphysical conjuncture. What this actually means is what we know, how we understand complexity, does not correspond with the scale and the nature of complexity. So we're out of balance intellectually, physically, emotionally, psychologically. And the familiar world, the world that we take for granted, this world, the world that we're in now, in a sense, is becoming a foreign country in the world itself. The gap between the world within the world and the world that we exist within is widening. Let me explain it this way. This is a picture of stone tools. We, our species, have always been technological. When we first arrived as a species, we inherited 70 of these stone tools, and all the things that those stone tools made, including other tools of wood and bone. So there is a direct line, a direct history from that moment in time, from those stone tools right through to what you're looking at now, the robotic world of contemporary technology, the world of electronic communication, the digital age. That all started with 70 stone tools as we as a species arrived in the world. That process continues. So that invites a kind of a rethinking of how we understand and feel about technology. Understanding that technology didn't just bring the material world into existence, to a very large extent it brought us into existence as it ontologically designed our mode of being in the world. We made a world, the world made us. It is a circular relation. Tools are not simply objects that we are in control of. Tools make us as well as what we make with tools. Now, understanding the human in this context, we need to remember we are two, not one. We are both and remain an animal, and we are a human, culturally formed being. Everybody comes into the world as an animal, and the nature of culture is that we are made human. Education, informally and formally, is a process of the construction of our humanness. But that's not a universal. The animal is universal, but the making of what it is that we become is subject to the culture in which we are inducted. So indigenous cultures had a very different cosmology, had a very different understanding of themselves in the universe than Western cosmologies. So although we have that commonality of an animality, we don't have the commonality of humanness. It changes. It is contested. Now, from the advanced technological cultures of the world, we're now starting to create something else. We are starting to create what people are calling the post-human, a hyper-technological being, a being designed by technology at a higher level, a massive transformation of our cognition. So what's now happening? A new debate is forming over the nature and the transformation of the human. But what is absent mostly from that debate is the recognition of indigenous understandings of humanity, so that it isn't simply that we are now becoming plural, but we've always been plural. So here is the university. Looking towards the future of the university is worth looking back. The first European university was in Italy, the University of Bologna, founded in 1158. Now, that wasn't the first university. There was a kind of a huge amount of knowledge created prior to that university in various cultures around the world, in China, in India, in the Middle East. And that process went back way before the University of Bologna. So we have in Greece Plato's Academy, but the knowledge of Plato's Academy didn't come from Plato. The knowledge of Plato's Academy actually came out of the Temple of Wassat in Egypt, which in turn was knowledge gained from Africa, particular Ethiopia. and from southern Mesopotamia. So the first Greek philosopher studied at the temple of Waset. So that knowledge was transferred in time in a process that was one of appropriation. The notion of appropriation of knowledge is crucial to understanding the creation and the future of the university. So in the Western account, for example, Pythagoras is given an enormous amount of significance in the history of geometry and mathematics. But through the knowledge that was gained from Egypt and the knowledge that was gained from basically Babylon and the time that he spent in that part of the world, again, there's the illusion of a Western moment of creation when in fact it came from non-Western sources. Equally, Nanyang University in China, again, existed almost 1,000 years before the University of Bologna. Nalanda in India, again, has a very long history. And very interestingly, the economist that is really kind of one of the most significant economists in India has refounded that university. So it disappeared for many, many decades and has recently been recreated. It has been brought back to life. So there's an interesting invitation there. The invitation is to revisit these ancient universities, these ancient knowledges, and discover what they can contribute to the thinking that can take us to the future. So, in terms of thinking otherwise, in thinking about how to think about the future, indigenous knowledge and knowledge of the ancient world has to be understood as a resource to complement the knowledge that we create in the present. So coming back to appropriation, the medieval university was a university with a theological project of trying to understand the nature of God. What it did was to appropriate classical thought from the Greeks and, in a sense, incorporate reason with the theological enterprise. That was an act of appropriation that over several hundred years transformed the very nature of the medieval university, producing the first modern university, the first university of modernity in 1694 in Germany by the Lutherans, the University of Halle. So that process of transformation was about appropriation from knowledge outside of the university. Now, what I'm saying to you is that the university now needs to change, now needs to reinvent itself, and it could only do that by another process of appropriation of knowledge outside the university as well as a generation of knowledge within inside the university. And when I was talking about knowledge from the ancient world, and when I was talking about knowledge from the indigenous world, that is part of what invites being explored to generate a process of appropriation. That is working against what I started off talking about when I mentioned Einstein. It's working against the condition of limitation produced by the formal divisions of knowledge and disciplines that really arrived as a foundation of education from the Enlightenment. They prevent the relational connections that are necessary to understand the complexity that we're in. So they are obstacles. So they established a condition of derelationality. They created this disjunctural condition between the world and knowledge that underpins structural unsustainability. Essentially, they created the trajectory that has taken us to the instrumentalization of how we think and how we act. They are indivisible from the epistemological foundation of the dialectic of sustainment. They are contradictory. They have brought a huge amount of understanding and a huge amount of creation into the world, but they've also created a condition of non-reflective darkness. There is a failure of understanding at the very heart of reason. At the very heart of reason, we've created an act of faith. Reason has become a belief. So here's, in a sense, the contradictory situation. At the formation of the modern university, knowledge was born into a condition of crisis. And I'm using the First World War as an example of this because it illustrates, in a sense, the contradiction of technology, a contradiction which continues, a contradiction which is in your everyday life, every day, where technology is mobilized in the service of humanity, but also in the creation of inhumanity. Technology represents a crisis of knowledge and a crisis of reason, because so often it is employed in the furtherance of the irrational. The irrational. The irrationality of war. The irrationality of hyperconsumption. The irrationality of environmental destruction. So in the pursuit of the solutions to problems, we can't simply mobilize reason as it is. We have to be able to go beyond reason. Now, none of these things can happen quickly. When I'm talking about transformation, I'm talking about transformation over decades. And I'm not pessimistic, because I know the seeds of the beginning of thinking otherwise exist. I know that they exist in this university. I know the process of learning to think another way has begun. The crucial thing is that it continues, that it accelerates, that it builds. This is our challenge. So in our epoch, universities everywhere face a huge challenge. They have to understand and overcome the epistemological foundations of what I've been talking about, the current global conditions of crisis. In other words, we have to learn to think another way in order to be another way. And as I said when I'm beginning, it isn't just a question of us objectively changing conditions in the world, it's our participation in this process changing us. We, to repeat, are the problem. The design challenge is that in learning to design another way, we design ourselves another way. The process that I'm talking about is a process of continued ontological design of what we are. And we have to liberate ourselves from the instrumentalism that we're currently connected to. And we have to liberate ourselves equally from simply sustaining the economic status quo, which is based upon an unsupportable principle, the principle of growth being unlimited. Nobody, I suspect in this room, believes in perpetual motion. But we have an economic system that in a way is based upon perpetual motion. The notion of continual growth is a condition of impossibility in a world of finite resources. So not only do we have to think and make another way, we also have to create a fundamentally different mode of exchange. An exchange between matter, an exchange between people. So, these are some of the agenda items of the university of the future. We have to learn to be able to identify and engage what actually is structurally unsustainable. And it isn't self-evident. Some things are quite clear, but some things are very, very invisible. So we have to learn how to bring the things that need to change into visibility. We have to subordinate education to the advancement of sustainment, and we have to stop teaching people how to deliver practices which are unsustainable, which are destructive, which are taking the future away. We have to gain a capability to create world making that is futural. In other words, we need to bring things into existence with the ontological characteristic of care and futuring. In other words, the designing of the design of the things that we need to bring into existence have to roll out into the future, creating a future with a future. We have to have a sufficient amount of modesty to recognize and understand that the complexity that we've created is beyond our comprehension, is beyond reason. Now that might sound strange, but I think if you think about nature, we've spent many, many hundreds of years trying to understand the natural world, and we only still understand a fragment of it. The same is true of the world that we have brought into existence. The naturalized artificial is like nature, only partially understood. But we are accelerating its production. So as we gain knowledge, that which needs to be understood is actually becoming more and more complex. And then we have to recognize and deal with the really fracturing nature of what we are, the fracturing nature of our humanity. The fact that two things are now colliding. There's the kind of the cultural fracturing of cultural difference, and there is the consequence of ontological, technological transformation of our being. At the two extremes, we have this notion of the post-human technological being, the being that at its extreme is identified by singularity as a being independent of the need of a body. That is the kind of the lunatic utopia of most extreme artificial intelligence. At the other extreme, we have huge numbers of people in the world who are simply being abandoned. And we have everything in between. That is a massive challenge. So this challenge effectively means reinventing the academy. And I'm using this kind of illustration of the word, in a sense, in two ways. Reinventing, as it were, in recreating, and reinventing in terms of making it a different kind of event, making learning a different kind of event. Recognizing that in the situation we're in, it isn't simply a question of coming to this institution as if it contained all knowledge, and that the program that we enroll in is going to deliver that part of knowledge that we are seeking to constitute our professional lives. Because the institution in the world we now exist has to go out and engage the world in a direct confrontation to learn about the nature of the problems that have to be engaged. And to illustrate this in relation to design, design is not, as the cliche of design education describes it, simply a problem-solving activity. Design has to be a problem-defining activity. And you have to go out in the world to engage the problem, to define and understand what it is, to decide whether you have any ability to solve it, to adapt to it, or find a way of simply living with it. So that is the challenge of the Academy, that is the challenge of design education. Design education has to become futural. So we need to learn how to confront the complexity. We need to be educated in a worldly way. Designers, above all, need to be educated people in the way that I'm talking about the challenges of education. As implied, they need to abandon disciplinary conditions of dependence. They need to be displaced from simply being taught how to design. That is no longer sufficient. They need to understand what to design and why they are designing it. That is the crucial, critical act that needs to be underpinning design education. Designers need to be directly connected with what design is and does, so they don't simply work with a received understanding of design. So, finally, and I hope not too presumptively, I want to say a little bit about Colombia. Historically, the nation is positioned between the South that was, the history of being a colonized nation, and the North that is, as in many ways that process of colonization continues economically and epistemologically. So I've become very interested in this area called border thinking, that tells us that where we are is indivisible from where we think. Our thinking is constituted in place. Now, the implication for Colombia as a nation on the underside of modernity, and colonialism is the underside of modernity. Modernity actually only gained its momentum from what it appropriated from its colonial conquests. So, as a nation on the underside of modernity is not the challenge to invert the position of historical disadvantage to one of future advantages. So what is so interesting in relation to Colombia and relation to design is what appears to be a condition of disadvantage, if you like, a condition of under, in inverted commas, development of these knowledges and practices is in fact an advantage. Colombia is in a position to invent, to innovate, to change, to create in a way that nations with heavily invested, deeply embedded, and very immobile structures of institutions around an area like design can't do. So I see the situation in Colombia as very exciting and very positive. So, finally, recognizing that life in the in-between spaces of borderland thought is in fact a space of becoming otherwise. Colombia is a space of becoming otherwise. It potentially is a space of the deconstruction of the foundations of placement, of how it has been placed in the world, how it is perceived. It is somebody and a somewhere that invites the creation of a new kind of assemblage, a new kind of knowledge that comes historically from here and appropriates selectively from there, creating a new understanding. It is a place, in truth, of border thinking, of the borderland that confronts knowing the ground of what and how we know here. It is a place that can break out of the disciplinary boundaries as it crosses borders. It becomes a place of nomadic thought. It is a place that can refuse the containment of the ownership and the institutions of elsewhere. It is a nation that exists between excess and poverty, a borderland condition where the economic, social, and cultural conditions beg the recognition and the merits of what I'm calling economic modesty. Economic modesty is one of the underpinning imperatives of the world in which we exist. It is something that invites innovation in place. So how would you think about the economics of modesty in Colombia, where the quality of life can be improved without the destruction of the excess of the unsustainable? Finally, all of this requires learning to act in time. And acting in time means acting in the medium of time. Time is a medium. We are in a condition where time is limited. Our finitude is being diminished. It doesn't feel like that. We don't know like that, but we do not have all the time in the world. And finally, acting in time is acting with a sense of urgency. The task of getting to the future is one that requires us to act now. Thank you very much for your attention.